He refused her without even looking at her face, and by morning, he would understand exactly what that moment had cost him. The clinic in Dust Hollow smelled of antiseptic and old wood, the kind of place where time moved slower than the wind outside, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to carry judgment. Ethan Caldwell stood near the front desk, hat in hand, dust still clinging to his boots from a 10-mile ride in, his jaw tight with the kind of pain he refused to name. Clara Whitmore stepped forward when his name was called, her steps steady, her uniform pressed clean despite the long shift already behind her, her eyes calm in a way that suggested she had seen worse than whatever Ethan thought he was carrying. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate, just offered a quiet nod and a simple gesture toward the hallway. Ethan's gaze flickered over her, quick at first, then slower, lingering just long enough for something unspoken to settle into the air between them. He exhaled through his nose, a sharp sound, and shook his head. "I'll wait," he said, voice low but firm, the kind of tone men used when they expected the world to adjust around them. The receptionist paused, pen hovering above paper, uncertainty tightening her grip. Clara didn't move. Ethan shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the worn floor, and added, "For someone else." The words landed heavier than he intended, or maybe exactly as heavy as he meant them to. A man sitting by the window glanced up, then quickly backed down, as if he had seen this before and knew better than to get involved. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the loose sign hanging above the door, the metal chain clinking in uneven rhythm. Clara's expression didn't change. She simply lowered her hand, nodded once, and stepped aside, making room for the next name to be called as if nothing had happened at all. But something had. It lingered in the silence that followed, in the way the receptionist avoided Clara's eyes, in the faint tightening of Ethan's shoulders as he leaned against the wall and crossed his arms, convincing himself he had made the right call. Minutes passed. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have, each second stretching thin. Ethan pressed a hand briefly against his side, then dropped it. When he noticed someone watching, pride settling back into place like a well-worn coat. Another nurse came and went. Another patient disappeared down the hallway, and still Clara remained, moving from room to room with the same quiet efficiency, her presence steady, unshaken, as if the moment at the front desk had never existed. Ethan watched her once more, just for a second, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes before he looked away again. He told himself it didn't matter. Told himself he had time. Out here, a man always believed he had time, until the land, or the body, or something deeper proved him wrong. And somewhere in that clinic, beneath the hum of quiet voices and the steady ticking of the clock, a consequence had already begun to take shape, silent and patient, waiting for its moment to be seen. The town of Dust Hollow did not offer many second chances, and the clinic was no different, its narrow hallway stretching back like a quiet promise that help would come only if you waited your turn and knew when to listen. Ethan Caldwell leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, pretending the ache in his side had dulled, pretending the tightness in his chest was nothing more than a long ride and a restless night. But the truth sat heavier than his boots, pressing in with every breath he took. The clock above the doorway read nearly 40 minutes past the hour, each tick slow and deliberate, as if it had no interest in hurrying for anyone, least of all a man who believed he could choose who was worthy of helping him. A younger nurse finally called his name, her voice unsure, and Ethan pushed off the wall, straightening his jacket as if that alone could restore control over the situation. He followed her down the hallway, passing Clara Whitmore as she stepped out of another room, her sleeves rolled just slightly, her hands steady as she removed a pair of gloves and dropped them into a bin without a sound. For a moment, their paths crossed close enough that he could hear her breathing, calm and even, untouched by the earlier exchange. He did not look at her this time, not directly, but something in his posture stiffened, a quiet recognition that lingered before he forced his attention forward again. The examination room was smaller than he expected, a single window letting in a thin line of afternoon light that cut across the worn floorboards and climbed halfway up the wall. The nurse motioned for him to sit, and he did, lowering himself carefully, masking the hesitation with a slight shift of his shoulders. She asked routine questions, the kind that should have been easy to answer, but Ethan found himself shortening every response, brushing past details as if speaking less would make the problem smaller. When she pressed lightly along his side, he inhaled sharply before he could stop himself, the sound breaking through his control for just a second too long. The nurse glanced at him, concern flickering across her face, then stepped back, uncertain. "The doctor will be in shortly," she said, her voice carrying a note of hesitation that did not belong in a place meant for certainty. Ethan nodded once, jaw tightening, eyes fixed on the far wall where the paint had begun to peel in thin strips, revealing older layers beneath, each one a reminder that time had a way of uncovering what people tried to cover up. Outside the room, footsteps moved back and forth, quiet voices exchanged in low tones, and somewhere down the hall, Clara's voice rose briefly, calm and measured, giving instructions that carried the kind of clarity that did not need to be repeated. Ethan shifted again, slower this time, the ache in his side spreading in a way that no longer felt like something he could simply wait out. He glanced toward the door, then away, his fingers tapping once against his knee before going still. The minutes stretched, longer now, heavier, and for the first time since he walked into that clinic, a thought slipped in uninvited, quiet but sharp enough to stay. Not all choices could be taken back. Some of them stayed exactly where they were made, waiting for the moment when they mattered most. The doctor did not arrive as quickly as Ethan expected, and the longer the room stayed quiet, the more the silence began to press against him, thick and steady like the heat before a storm. He shifted on the narrow examination table, the paper beneath him crinkling in sharp protest, and tried to slow his breathing, counting each inhale as if that alone could bring things back under control. It did not. The ache had changed. It was no longer something he could ignore or hide behind a straight back and a steady gaze. It moved deeper now, spreading in a way that made every second feel longer than the last. Outside the door, voices passed by again, and this time he listened more closely, not for words, but for one voice in particular. He did not realize he was listening for her until he heard it. Clara Whitmore spoke somewhere down the hall, low and calm, giving instructions that carried without effort, the kind of tone people followed without question. There was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just quiet authority wrapped in patience. Ethan stared at the wall, jaw tightening as that sound settled in his chest in a way he could not explain. The doctor finally entered, a man older than Ethan had expected, with tired eyes and careful hands that suggested years of practice and more than a few long nights. He greeted Ethan with a brief nod and moved straight to the examination, asking questions that demanded fuller answers than Ethan had given before. This time, Ethan did not shorten them as much. The words came slower, heavier, shaped by something that felt closer to truth than pride. The doctor pressed along his side, pausing longer than the nurse had, his expression shifting just slightly, enough for Ethan to notice. "How long has it been like this?" the doctor asked, not looking up. Ethan hesitated, then answered, "Since yesterday morning." The doctor nodded once, thoughtful, then stepped back, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. "You should have come in sooner," he said, not as a reprimand, but as a statement that carried weight all on its own. Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his eyes dropping briefly before lifting again. "I did," he said quietly. The doctor glanced at him then, studying his face for a moment longer than necessary, as if searching for something beneath the surface. "And?" the doctor asked, leaving the rest of the sentence open. Ethan did not answer right away. The memory of the front desk, the look he had given, the words he had chosen, all of it came back sharper now, clearer, stripped of the confidence he had wrapped it in before. He shifted again, slower this time, the movement careful, deliberate. "I waited," he said. Finally, the doctor held his gaze for a second, then nodded once, understanding more than the words alone revealed. He stepped toward the door and opened it halfway, his voice carrying into the hallway. "Clara," he called, simple and direct. The name hung in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause, the clinic holding its breath in a way that felt almost deliberate. Ethan's chest tightened, not from the ache this time, but from something else, something quieter and harder to ignore. Footsteps approached, steady and unhurried, and when Clara appeared in the doorway, her presence filled the space without force, without demand, just by being there. She looked from the doctor to Ethan, her expression calm, unchanged, as if nothing had ever passed between them at all. The doctor stepped aside slightly, giving her room. "I need your hands on this," he said, and there was no question in his voice, only certainty. Clara nodded once, stepping into the room with the same quiet confidence she had carried all day. Ethan watched her, really watched her this time, not as a glance or a judgment, but as a man beginning to understand that something he had dismissed without thought might have been the one thing he needed all along. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, before a single action was taken, the weight of what could not be undone settled fully into place. Clara stepped fully into the room without hesitation, the door easing shut behind her with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been, sealing the space in a quiet that felt deliberate. She did not look at Ethan first. She looked at the chart in the doctor's hand, then at the position of his shoulders, the way he held his breath just a fraction too long, the subtle tension that most people would miss if they were not trained to see it. Her eyes moved with purpose, not curiosity, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying no trace of what had happened earlier. "How long has the pain been sharp like this?" she asked, already reaching for the instruments she needed, her movements precise, practiced, efficient in a way that suggested she had done this more times than anyone could count. Ethan swallowed before answering, the words slower now, stripped of the edge he had carried before. "It got worse a few hours ago," he said, his voice lower, quieter, as if the room itself demanded something more honest. Clara nodded once, acknowledging the answer without judgment, and stepped closer, her presence firm but not imposing. "I am going to check again," she said, not asking permission, not needing to, her tone carrying a quiet authority that made the moment feel guided rather than forced. Ethan tensed slightly as her hands moved, not from discomfort alone, but from the awareness of who she was and what he had done just an hour earlier. He kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling, watching a small crack that ran across the plaster like a line drawn long ago and never repaired. Clara worked in silence for a moment, her focus absolute, her attention on the details that mattered, the kind that did not show themselves to someone who only looked at the surface. The doctor observed quietly from the side, arms crossed, allowing her space, trusting her without needing to say it out loud. "You came in earlier today," Clara said after a moment, her voice still even, not accusatory, just stating a fact that hung in the air between them. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, the weight of that sentence settling deeper than anything the doctor had said. "Yes," he answered, the word short, carrying more than its length suggested. Clara did not pause, did not change her pace, but something in her tone shifted just slightly, enough to be felt rather than heard. "It would have been easier to manage then," she said, not looking at him, her attention still on the task in front of her, her hands steady, unshaken. There was no blame in the words, no edge, just truth delivered without decoration. Ethan let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling heavier now, not from the pain alone, but from the realization that came with it. He shifted slightly, careful this time, as if even the smallest movement carried consequence. The room remained quiet except for the soft sounds of Clara working, the faint rustle of fabric, the measured rhythm of her breathing. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the building in long, low whispers that seemed to echo the stillness inside. Clara finished what she was doing and stepped back, just enough to look at the doctor, giving a small nod that spoke of understanding reached without needing explanation. The doctor returned the nod, then glanced at Ethan, his expression thoughtful, measured, but Ethan did not look at him. His eyes had shifted, finally, from the ceiling to Clara, watching her not with judgment this time, but with something quieter, heavier, something closer to recognition. And in that quiet space, with no raised voices, no harsh words, the consequence of a single moment began to take its full shape, not loud, not sudden, but steady and impossible to ignore. The doctor exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried decision with it, and stepped closer to the table, his eyes moving between Clara and Ethan with a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. "We can still manage this," he said, his voice steady, measured, "but it is going to take more care now than it would have earlier." The words settled into the room like dust after a long ride, light at first, then heavier as they found their place. Ethan nodded once, but the motion felt smaller than it should have, as if even agreement had lost some of its weight. Clara had already moved to prepare what was needed next, her hands working with the same calm precision, each motion efficient, unhurried, untouched by the tension that had begun to fill the space. She did not rush to reassure him, did not offer comfort in the way some might have, but there was something steadier in her presence, something that did not waver even when everything else did. "You will need to stay for observation," she said, her tone even, leaving no room for negotiation, not because she demanded control, but because she understood the situation better than anyone else in the room. Ethan glanced toward the door, then back at her, the instinct to leave still there, still familiar, but weaker now, pushed aside by something he could not ignore. "How long?" he asked, his voice quieter than before, the edge gone, replaced by something closer to acceptance. Clara met his gaze briefly. "Not long, just enough. Long enough to make sure it does not get worse," she said, and there was a weight in those words that reached further than their simplicity suggested. The doctor nodded in agreement, then stepped aside, giving Clara the lead without needing to announce it, a silent acknowledgement of trust that spoke louder than any title or position. Ethan noticed that. He noticed the way the doctor deferred, the way the room itself seemed to follow her rhythm, not out of obligation, but because it worked. He shifted slightly on the table, more careful now, his movements slower, deliberate, as if he had begun to understand that control was not something you claimed, but something you earned by knowing what you were doing. Clara adjusted the setup beside him, her focus unwavering, her attention on the details that would matter hours from now, not just in the moment. "Try to stay still," she said softly, and there was no impatience in it, only clarity. Ethan nodded again, this time without hesitation, his eyes following her for a second longer than before. He wanted to say something then, something to bridge the space between what had happened and what was happening now, but the words did not come, or maybe they came too late. The silence that filled their place was not empty. It was full of everything he had already said and everything he could not take back. Outside, the wind had calmed, the rattling sign no longer moving, as if the town itself had settled into a quieter rhythm. Inside the room, time continued forward, steady and unrelenting, each second carrying them further from the moment at the front desk and closer to something that could not be undone. Clara finished her adjustments and stepped back just slightly, her posture relaxed but ready, her presence constant in a way that did not demand attention but held it anyway. Ethan looked at her once more, really looked this time, not at her appearance, not at what he had judged before, but at the way she worked, the way she carried herself, the quiet certainty that had been there all along. And in that realization, slow and unmistakable, he understood that the mistake had never been about who she was. It had been about what he chose not to see. The clinic settled into a slower rhythm as the afternoon light faded, the thin beam from the window shifting across the wall until it disappeared completely, leaving the room lit only by a single overhead lamp that hummed softly above them. Ethan lay back against the narrow table, his breathing steadier now, though not as easy as it should have been, his body no longer fighting him, but not fully at rest either. Clara moved quietly between the counter and his side, checking, adjusting, observing, each motion deliberate, each step measured in a way that suggested she was always thinking 2 steps ahead of what anyone else could see. The doctor had stepped out minutes earlier, leaving the room in her care without a second thought, the door closing behind him with the same quiet certainty that had followed every decision made since she entered. Ethan noticed that too. He noticed how natural it seemed, how unquestioned. He turned his head slightly, watching her as she wrote something down on the chart, her handwriting steady, unhurried, as if time moved differently when she was working. "Does it feel any different now?" she asked without looking up, her voice calm, even, the same tone she had carried since the moment she walked in. Ethan hesitated before answering, not because he did not know, but because he wanted to be sure he was telling the truth this time. "It is not as sharp," he said, his words careful, considered. Clara nodded once, marking something on the paper, then set it aside. "That means it is responding," she said, simple, direct, no need to explain more than that. Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing just slightly, but the weight in his chest remained, not from the pain, but from everything that had come before this moment. The silence stretched again, but it was different now, not tense, not uncertain, just quiet, filled with the steady presence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Ethan looked toward her, then away, then back again, the movement small, almost hesitant. "I should have," he began, the words forming slowly, heavier than anything he had said all day. Clara did not turn immediately. She finished what she was doing first, placing each item back where it belonged, her movements unbroken, then finally faced him, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady. "You are here now," she said, and that was all. No correction, no invitation for explanation, just a line drawn between what had happened and what mattered next. Ethan swallowed, the rest of his sentence fading before it could fully take shape. He nodded once, quieter this time, accepting what she had given him, even if it was not what he expected. Outside the room, the clinic carried on, footsteps passing, voices low, the world moving forward without pause. Inside, the air felt still, grounded, as if the space itself had settled around something unspoken. Clara stepped closer again, checking his condition with the same steady focus, her hands precise, her attention unwavering. Ethan watched her, not with doubt, not with judgment, but with a kind of understanding that had come too late to change the past, but not too late to change what came after. And in that quiet room, under the soft hum of the light, he realized something that did not need to be said out loud. Respect was not something you decided after the fact. It was something you recognized when it was already there, waiting, long before you ever looked closely enough to see it. The evening settled fully over Dust Hollow, and with it came a deeper quiet inside the clinic, the kind that made every small sound feel more deliberate, more noticed, as if the building itself had slowed its breathing. Ethan remained on the narrow table, no longer shifting as much, his body finally beginning to cooperate, but his mind moving in a different direction entirely. The pain had eased enough for him to think clearly, and that clarity brought something he could not push aside. Clara moved near the window now, adjusting the curtain just slightly to block the last trace of fading light, her silhouette steady against the dim glow of the lamp. She checked his chart again, then glanced at the clock, measuring time in a way that did not feel rushed, only precise. "You are stabilizing," she said after a moment, her voice low, certain, as if she trusted the process more than the outcome. Ethan nodded, then hesitated, his fingers tightening briefly against the edge of the table before relaxing again. "You knew earlier, didn't you?" he said, the question coming out slower than he intended, not accusing, not sharp, just searching. Clara did not answer immediately. She finished marking the chart, placed it down, and turned to face him fully, her posture calm, her expression unchanged. "There were signs," she said, simple, direct, without pride, without hesitation. Ethan let out a quiet breath, his gaze dropping for a second before lifting again. "And I walked away from that," he added, more to himself than to her, the realization settling deeper now, no longer abstract, no longer distant. Clara studied him for a brief moment, not with judgment, not with sympathy, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be explained. "People make choices with what they think they see," she said, her voice even, steady, carrying a weight that felt earned rather than given. The words stayed in the air, and Ethan did not respond right away. He looked toward the door, then back at her, the distance between them smaller now, not in space, but in something harder to measure. "I did not see much," he said finally, his voice lower, stripped of anything defensive. Clara nodded once, accepting that without adding anything to it, then stepped closer again, checking his condition with the same careful attention as before. Her hands moved with purpose, her focus unwavering, as if the moment they were in deserved all of it, regardless of what had happened before. Ethan watched her again, this time without hesitation, his eyes following each movement, understanding now that what he had dismissed was not just skill, but something built over time, something that could not be judged in a glance or reduced to an assumption. Outside, a horse passed by, the sound of hooves soft against the dirt road, fading quickly into the distance, a reminder that the world beyond the clinic continued on without pause. Inside, the air felt grounded, steady, shaped by quiet decisions rather than loud ones. Clara finished her check and stepped back, her posture relaxed but attentive, always ready, always present. Ethan drew in a slow breath, deeper this time, and let it out just as slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing in a way that had nothing to do with the treatment alone. He looked at her once more, not searching this time, not questioning, just seeing. And in that moment, without needing to say it, without needing to correct anything out loud, he understood something that would stay with him long after he left that room. Some mistakes did not shout when they happened. They whispered, quietly enough that you only heard them when it was already too late to pretend you had not made them. The night deepened outside, pressing against the windows with a stillness that felt almost deliberate. And inside the clinic the world narrowed down to quiet footsteps, soft voices, and the steady rhythm of care that did not ask for attention, but held it anyway. Ethan had been moved to a small bed along the wall, no longer on the examination table, a thin blanket pulled over him that carried the faint scent of clean linen and something older, something that spoke of years of use and quiet endurance. He lay there with his eyes open, not because he could not rest, but because his thoughts would not let him. Clara sat at a small desk near the door, reviewing notes under the dim light, her posture relaxed but alert, the kind of stillness that was never truly still. Every few minutes, she would glance up, not directly at him, but toward the space he occupied, checking without interrupting, present without pressing. The room held a quiet understanding that needed no words. Ethan turned his head slightly, watching her again, not out of curiosity now, but out of something closer to respect, something that had grown slowly, quietly, over the past hours. "Do you stay this late every night?" he asked, his voice softer than before, careful not to break the calm that had settled between them. Clara did not look up right away. She finished the line she was writing, set the pen down, then answered without lifting her gaze fully. "Most nights," she said, simple, unadorned, as if it required no further explanation. Ethan nodded to himself, the answer fitting into something he was beginning to understand. "Even when it is quiet," he added, more statement than question. Clara gave a small nod, finally meeting his eyes for a brief moment. "That is when it matters most," she said, and there was something in her tone that suggested experience rather than opinion. Ethan let the words settle, turning them over in his mind, feeling their weight in a way he had not expected. The silence returned, but it was not empty. It carried the presence of two people who no longer needed to fill it. Outside, the wind had stopped completely, the night air still, the town resting in a way that only came after a long day had fully passed. Inside, the lamp cast a soft glow across the room, catching the edges of Clara's movements as she stood and walked over to check on him again, her steps light, measured, her focus unchanged. She adjusted the blanket slightly, checked his condition with a brief, practiced motion, then stepped back, giving him space without ever fully leaving. Ethan watched her, his gaze steady, and for a moment, the words he had been holding back rose again, stronger this time, closer to the surface. "I was wrong," he said quietly, the admission simple, without defense, without excuse. Clara paused, not in surprise, not in reaction, but in acknowledgement. She looked at him for a second, then gave a small nod, accepting the words without amplifying them, without turning them into something larger than they were. "What matters is what you do with that," she said, her voice calm, grounded, offering no judgment, only direction. Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing further, the tension that had followed him into the clinic finally beginning to loosen its hold. He looked at her again, not searching this time, not questioning, just seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time since he walked through the door. And in that quiet room, under the soft light and the still night beyond the windows, something shifted that could not be undone, not because it was forced, not because it was demanded, but because it had been earned in silence, one steady moment at a time. The hours moved quietly through the night, each one marked not by noise but by the absence of it, the kind of stillness that made a man aware of his own breathing, of the weight of his thoughts, of everything he had said and everything he had chosen not to say. Ethan lay back against the pillow, the thin blanket rising and falling with each steady breath, his body no longer resisting, but his mind unwilling to settle. The pain had softened into something distant now, a dull reminder rather than a sharp demand, but what replaced it held more weight than any physical discomfort ever could. Clara remained near the desk, the lamp casting a soft circle of light around her, her figure steady within it, moving only when necessary, writing, checking, pausing, always aware without appearing to watch. There was something in that presence that made the room feel anchored, as if nothing inside it could drift too far from where it needed to be. Ethan turned his head slightly, his eyes finding her again, not searching, not questioning, just observing the quiet rhythm she carried with her. "You do not seem tired," he said after a while, his voice low, careful, as if speaking too loudly might break something that had taken hours to settle. Clara looked up this time, not immediately, but after finishing the line she was on, her attention never divided, only shifted. "I am," she said simply, her tone unchanged, honest without complaint. Ethan gave a small nod, absorbing that, then glanced toward the window where the darkness pressed close against the glass, the town beyond it unseen but present. "Then why stay?" he asked, the question coming slower, shaped by something deeper than curiosity. Clara considered that for a moment, not because she needed to find an answer, but because she chose how much of it to give. "Because someone has to," she said finally, her voice steady, grounded, carrying a truth that did not need to be expanded. Ethan let the words settle, feeling their weight in the same way he had felt everything else that night, slowly, deliberately, without resistance. He shifted slightly, testing the movement, finding it easier now, more controlled, and for the first time since he had arrived, he allowed himself to rest his head fully back against the pillow. The tension in his body had eased, but something else had taken its place, something quieter, something that stayed. Clara stood and walked over again, checking on him with the same measured care, her hands precise, her focus unwavering, her presence unchanged from the moment she first entered the room. Ethan watched her, not out of habit now, but out of recognition, understanding that what he had dismissed in a glance had taken years to build, years he had not considered, years he had reduced to a single moment of judgment. "You could have said no," he said quietly, the thought arriving late but landing with weight. Clara paused just slightly, enough to acknowledge the words, but not enough to interrupt what she was doing. "That is not how this works," she replied, her tone calm, not defensive, not corrective, just clear. Ethan nodded, the answer settling into him in a way that left no room for argument. He looked at her again, then away, then back once more, the movement slower each time, as if he was trying to hold on to the moment just a little longer. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a door closed, the sound faint, carried on the night air before fading completely. Inside, the clinic remained still, grounded, unchanged. And in that quiet, with nothing left to distract him, Ethan understood something that would follow him long after he left that bed. Some things could be forgiven, some could be understood, but some moments stayed exactly where they happened, waiting, not to punish, not to accuse, but to remind you of the person you chose to be when it mattered most. The first light of morning crept slowly through the edge of the curtain, thin and pale, stretching across the floor before climbing the side of the bed where Ethan lay awake, not because he had not slept, but because sleep had come in shallow pieces, broken by thoughts that refused to settle. The clinic had changed with the dawn, the quiet of night giving way to the softer sounds of a new day beginning, footsteps returning, voices low but present, the building waking in its own steady rhythm. Clara was already on her feet, moving between tasks with the same calm precision, as if the passing of hours had no effect on her focus, only on the work that needed to be done. Ethan watched her from where he lay, the light catching the edge of her profile as she checked the chart again, her expression unchanged, grounded, as it had been all night. He shifted slightly, testing his body, finding the movement easier now, more natural, the discomfort reduced to something manageable, something that no longer controlled him. But the weight in his chest remained, not from pain, but from understanding. Clara noticed the movement without turning immediately. "How does it feel this morning?" she asked, her voice steady, familiar now in a way that had not been possible just hours ago. Ethan took a moment before answering, not out of uncertainty, but out of care, choosing his words more deliberately than he had before. "Better," he said, then paused, adding quietly, "Because you caught it." Clara nodded once, accepting the statement without reaction, without acknowledgement beyond what was necessary. She stepped closer, checking his condition again with the same measured attention, her hands steady, her focus unwavering. "It is improving," she said simply, confirming what he already felt, grounding it in something real. Ethan watched her as she worked, his gaze steady, no longer shifting away, no longer guarded. "I almost walked out," he said after a moment, the words coming without hesitation this time, shaped by something closer to truth than pride. Clara did not stop, did not change her pace, but there was a slight pause in her movement, enough to show she had heard. "But you did not," she replied, her tone even, leaving the weight of the choice exactly where it belonged. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes moving toward the window where the light had grown stronger, the town outside beginning to take shape in the distance. "Not at first," he said, more quietly, the admission landing with more force than anything he had said before. Clara finished her check and stepped back, her posture relaxed but attentive, her presence steady as ever. "Then remember that," she said, her voice calm, not instructing, not correcting, just placing the thought where it could be kept. Ethan nodded slowly, the words settling into him in a way that felt permanent, not because they were repeated, but because they were understood. The doctor entered shortly after, his steps familiar, his presence easy, and he gave Clara a brief glance that carried quiet approval before turning his attention to Ethan. He reviewed the notes, asked a few questions, then gave a small nod, satisfied with the progress. "You will be able to leave today," he said, his tone practical, steady. "But take it slow. Do not ignore it again." Ethan nodded, accepting the instruction without argument, without hesitation. Clara stood just to the side, silent, present, her role shifting without announcement, from constant care to quiet watchfulness. Ethan looked at her once more, not searching, not questioning, just seeing clearly, fully, the way he should have from the beginning. And in that morning light, as the clinic returned to its rhythm and the world outside began another day, he understood something that would stay with him far longer than the pain ever could. Some consequences do not come from what happens after. They come from the moment you realize who you were when you had the chance to be better. The hallway outside had begun to fill with the low murmur of voices, boots brushing against wooden floors, doors opening and closing in a steady rhythm that signaled the day had fully taken hold. And inside the small room, Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, boots back on, hat resting in his hands as he turned it slowly, the motion absent, thoughtful. The doctor had already moved on to the next patient, his presence replaced by the quiet efficiency of the clinic continuing without pause, and Clara stood near the doorway, reviewing one last note before closing the chart with a soft, final sound. Ethan looked up at her, not quickly, not uncertainly, but with a steadiness that had not been there when he first walked in. He stood carefully, testing his balance, finding it firm enough, though he moved with more awareness now, more respect for what his body had tried to tell him before he chose not to listen. Clara glanced at him briefly, her eyes checking without lingering, confirming what she already knew. "You are steady enough," she said, her voice calm, grounded, offering no excess, only what was needed. Ethan nodded, then hesitated, the moment stretching just slightly as something unspoken rose again, heavier now, more defined. He shifted the hat in his hands, his fingers tightening around the brim before relaxing again. "I do not expect you to forget what I said," he began, his voice measured, quieter than before, but clearer, each word placed with intention. Clara did not interrupt. She did not look away either. She simply listened, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. "But I needed to say that I was wrong," he continued, the words simple, stripped of anything that did not belong to them. "Not because of what happened after, because of what I chose before." The room held still for a second, the sounds from the hallway fading just enough to leave space for the weight of what he had said. Clara studied him briefly, not searching, not measuring, just acknowledging. Then she gave a small nod, the motion quiet, but certain. "Then remember it," she said, her tone even, neither soft nor sharp, just grounded in truth. Ethan let out a breath he had been holding without realizing it, the tension in his shoulders easing in a way that felt different from before, not lighter, but clearer. He placed his hat back on his head, adjusting it once, a familiar gesture that now carried a different kind of awareness. He stepped toward the door, then paused, his hand resting briefly on the frame as he looked back at her one last time. Clara had already turned slightly, preparing for the next patient, her focus shifting forward, her work continuing without hesitation, without pause, as if the moment they had shared had already found its place and no longer needed attention. Ethan watched that for a second longer, understanding now that what mattered was not being seen, not being acknowledged, but choosing to see clearly when it counted. He gave a small nod, more to himself than to her, then stepped out into the hallway, the sounds of the clinic returning around him, steady, unchanged. As he walked toward the exit, the light from outside growing brighter with each step, he carried something with him that had nothing to do with the treatment he received. It was quieter than that, heavier, something that would not fade with time or distance. Because out here, in a place where people often judged fast and spoke faster, the lessons that stayed were not the ones shouted across a room. They were the ones learned in silence, long after the moment had passed, when there was nothing left to do but remember exactly who you had been when it mattered most. The sunlight outside felt different when Ethan stepped through the clinic doors, brighter than it had any right to be, stretching across the dusty street in long, clean lines that made everything look sharper than it had the day before. The air carried the faint smell of dry earth and wood smoke, familiar, unchanged, and yet something in it settled differently against him now. He paused just outside the doorway, one hand resting briefly on the frame, his eyes adjusting to the open space after the quiet confinement of the clinic. The town of Dust Hollow moved on around him, wagons rolling slowly past, a man leading a horse by the reins, voices exchanging greetings that carried no memory of what had happened inside those walls. To them, it was just another morning. To him, it was not. He stepped forward onto the wooden walkway, boots striking with a steady rhythm, each step firm, deliberate, as if he was testing not just his footing, but the way he carried himself. Across the street, a group of men stood near the general store, their conversation easy, unburdened, the kind of talk that filled space without meaning much. One of them glanced in Ethan's direction, gave a small nod, then went back to speaking, nothing more, nothing less. Ethan returned the nod out of habit, but his attention drifted quickly, pulled back toward the clinic behind him. The door had already closed, the moment inside it sealed away from view, but not from memory. He adjusted his hat slightly, the motion slower than it had been before, more aware, less automatic. The ride back to his ranch would take a little over 8 miles, maybe 10 if he took the longer path along the creek, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to rush it. His horse stood tied to the post where he had left it, calm, patient, as if it had been waiting without question, the way some things in life simply stayed where you left them. Ethan walked over, running a hand along the animal's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm, grounding, familiar. He untied the reins slowly, his movements measured, thoughtful, then paused again before mounting, his gaze drifting back once more toward the clinic. There was no reason for it, no expectation, just a quiet pull that he did not try to explain. The windows reflected the morning light, offering nothing back, no glimpse inside, no sign of the people who continued their work beyond them. Clara was in there, somewhere beyond that glass, already moving forward, already focused on the next person who needed her, not holding on to what had passed, not waiting for acknowledgement, not needing it. Ethan understood that now. He placed his foot in the stirrup and pulled himself up into the saddle, settling in with a slight shift of weight, his body responding more easily than it had the day before. He gathered the reins, gave a light signal, and the horse began to move, hooves pressing into the dirt road with a steady, unhurried rhythm. As he rode out of Dust Hollow, the town slowly falling behind him, the space around him opened up, wide and quiet, the horizon stretching out in a way that made everything feel both smaller and more significant at the same time. The wind brushed lightly against him, carrying nothing but open air and distance, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, letting it settle, letting everything settle. When he opened them again, the road ahead was clear, unchanged, the same path he had taken countless times before. But he was not the same man riding it. And that difference, quiet and steady, would follow him long after the dust from this morning had settled back into the ground.